Okay, the next session promises to be really fascinating. It's on South-South cooperation under FIPIC, which, as I'm sure you know, stands for the Forum for India-Pacific Islands Cooperation. We heard a little bit yesterday of some of the challenges faced by Pacific Islands threatened with climate change. They didn't cause this problem, but they're in danger of being quite literally overwhelmed by its consequences. But they're not taking it lying down. There's lots of bold initiatives coming out of the Pacific. There's also a lot of collaboration starting up between Pacific Islands on the one hand and the international community on the other, foremost of all being India. And we're going to hear a good deal now about how India and the Pacific Islands are working together in practical terms to tackle the challenges related to climate change and the opportunities for sustainability. So you've got a great expert panel who are going to tell us what this means in practice. So I'm going to invite them up onto the dais one by one. First of all, the chair of the panel, Dr. Ajay Mathur, Director General of TERI. Then Mr. Ivo de Boer, who's the founder of Responsibility and a former Executive Secretary of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. Monsieur François Martel, who's Secretary General of the Pacific Islands Development Forum. Colonel Sanjiv Sethi, who's the Director South of the Ministry of External Affairs of the Government of India. Welcome. And last but not least, Professor Ambuj Sagar, Head of the School of Public Policy at the Indian Institute of Technology here in Delhi. Professor Sagar.
And Joshua Wycliffe.
Oh, I'm so sorry. Have I promoted you or demoted you, maybe?
No, Joshua needs to join us.
Ah, excellent. That's very good to hear. Please come and join us. Mr. Joshua Wycliffe, Permanent Secretary for Local Government, Housing and Environment of the Government of the Republic of Fiji. Welcome.
Well, first of all, let me tell you what a pleasure it is to have this distinguished panel with us. Ambuj, Colonel Sethi, Ivo, François, Joshua. And we look at the larger question of the effectiveness of Paris and the instrument that is used to bring the advantages of Paris to the world and to each one of us, that is the nationally determined contributions, and to look at this in the context of the Pacific Islands. Very, very clearly, as we move ahead, moving to newer technologies, newer practices is at the heart of the change towards an economy that produces less carbon dioxide and is also resilient in terms of the impacts that climate change produces. If we look at the nationally determined contributions that countries have made to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, all of them, bar none, has renewables as a central part of the action that they do. Many of them also include energy efficiency as a component. Now, at one point of time, the nationally determined contributions were looked at as largely focusing on mitigation. But several countries have adaptation components in their NDCs as well. And particularly those that are there are many which are around managing water and also managing droughts as well as the impacts of more intense cyclones. But water is there again in everybody who has addressed adaptation in their NDCs. What it tells us is that in terms of technologies and practices, we need to move towards a new set which are suited to local conditions. They are adapted, they have a large market, and there is financing available to make them go through. And financing, of course, is at the end that he needs something, he is willing to pay for it. that is the ideal situation. Now, in reaching there, we may go through subsidies, we may go through ways in which we are helping the finance sector, but ultimately, if I am willing to pay what I need for, that is a sustainable solution. Unfortunately, we are not there. As we move ahead, let me start by asking Mr. De Boer on the nature of the Paris Agreement, the nationally determined contributions, and what do you think, Ivo, are the challenges of implementation of the nationally determined contributions, and how can we overcome these?
First of all, good morning, everyone, and great to see you here on Saturday morning in such large numbers. I wanted to start, Ajay, by congratulating you and the TERI team on what once again has been an absolutely fantastic World Sustainable Development Summit.
Thank you.
With many great panel discussions so far already. Having said that, I must say that I sit here not in relation to this summit, but in general with rather mixed feelings. Looking back over my history, your history, the history of many of us in the climate change debate, I think there are many positive things that we can report on, that we can note. The advances that we've made in terms of our understanding of the science, the advances that we've made on technology, for example, the prices of wind and renewables coming down 70% in just the last 5 years. We've seen huge innovations in the finance domain, partly due to the fact that in at least my part of the world, interest rates have come down very significantly, but also the development banks committing to 30% of their funding on the climate change agenda, new finance instruments being created like the Green Climate Fund, and at the same time, in many parts of the developing world, especially in Africa, things like mobile banking really beginning to reach the bottom of the pyramid and provide finances to people that never had access to them before. And of course, a couple of years ago, not only the Paris Agreement, but the Agreement on the Sustainable Development Goals and some very important progress on financing for development. So that, I think, is all positive things and good to start on a positive note. Not so positive, I think, is the reality that, at least in my perception, the 2 degrees or the well below 2 degrees, that we're not on track towards achieving that. Secondly, that in my perception, the principles, many of the principles that underpin the Climate Change Convention in terms of supporting each other are not being met. Thirdly, my sense that the international system is not equipped to deliver on the climate change challenge. The United Nations system has an organization for absolutely everything under the sun except energy. And at the same time, we see the UN Development Program, which I appreciate a lot, being almost close to bankruptcy. In fact, I would argue that the climate justice that Prime Minister Modi was calling for yesterday is hard to find at this moment in time. So all in all, my sense is that the commitments that were made in Paris, to use a phrase that's very popular in my country, that those commitments are skating on very thin ice. But as Laurence Toubiana, who spoke yesterday and who was very closely involved in that Paris Climate Change Agreement, said, we're living in a new world and happily under different circumstances. In the context of that new world, to my mind, and in the context also of South-South cooperation, 3 challenges are central, and those are challenges around, first of all, risk, secondly, around rate of return, and thirdly, around size of market or size of projects that we're talking about. Now, as long as we're in a situation where money follows the path of least resistance, the money goes where it's easiest to make a return, these are the 3 issues which I think we need to address. Now, this panel is about South-South cooperation. And South-South cooperation reminds me of a Dutch saying, which is that it's better to have a good neighbor than a far friend. So look for cooperation first and foremost at all. Now, how does that relate to risk, rate of return, and size of market? First of all, in my perception, in my experience, a great deal of the risk that stands in the way of achieving the Paris goals, and certainly in the way of the private sector engaging, is non-financial policy-related risk. And to understand that policy risk at the national level is really something you can do best by engaging counterparts from your region who have explored similar challenges and have found solutions that are relevant to your setting, rather than adopting the approaches of an industrialized country which have been at that stage maybe 20 or 30 years ago. So I think the relevance to the risk agenda can best be addressed by deploying local knowledge. In terms of rate of return, and I've already mentioned this, some of the best examples of enhancing rate of return, allowing the private sector to engage most positively, are actually from countries in this region, are from countries around you. And here I'm thinking of the example of the Grameen Bank and what it managed to do. I'm thinking of what M-Pesa did in East Africa on mobile banking and making credit facilities accessible to people who don't have bank accounts, passports, basically to people who don't exist. And then the way in which in many parts of the world ICT has been used to inform bankers about market prices and the technology which they can deploy. So also to enhance rate of return, I think many of the solutions that are most applicable come from the South, from countries around you. So that is why I think South-South cooperation is extremely relevant to rate of return. And the same probably also applies to the third issue, which is around size of market. Size of market, I mean, my experience is that many of the development banks are not really interested in anything smaller than $50 million because of the transaction costs involved. It's very, very difficult to do a rural decentralized renewable energy project and spend $50 million on it. So it's about bundling smaller projects into a larger size. And there I also see some of the most positive experiences coming from emerging economies and countries in this region. I hope that by now I've held a warm and convincing plea around the importance of South-South cooperation, so I can stop there. I hope the cooperation will happen in the context of the partnership that you're launching today, and that it will not just be a partnership. I'm sure it will not just be a partnership of think tanks, but it will be a partnership of think and do people. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ivo. You know, this leads us to the question that when you're talking about South-South partnerships, and we are talking of policies and best practices moving from one country in the South to another, then what is the needs of the cooperation that can enhance and actually accelerate this kind of best practice and policies as well as technologies transfer? Ambuj, you've been working in this area and would greatly appreciate your thoughts on how to accelerate this.
Sure. Thank you very much, Ajay, and thank you very much for having me here. I think you were mentioning in the conversation just before this session that this is probably one of the most important sessions of your summit, if not the most important one, and I actually very much believe that. And why is that? I think it's been highlighted here, I'm sure at other places in your summit, but everybody here in the audience knows that the NDCs that developing countries have undertaken to achieve are very ambitious. We also know that the level of ambition is only going to ratchet up over time. We also know that as developing countries think and plan to achieve these NDCs, they also have to worry about a range of other developmental challenges. And so what that actually leads to is, excuse me, I've got a cold. What that leads to is a kind of very complex landscape where developing country policymakers and other actors have to think about how do you achieve these very ambitious commitments with the necessarily limited resources you have at hand, while at the same time taking care of other development objectives. So just to give you an example, if you are talking about the fact that developing countries have very ambitious renewable energy targets, but the question that may appear for policymaker in developing countries, well, as we achieve these targets, what are the other objectives we need to think about? Do we want to also think about questions of livelihoods or putting together an industrial base? Do we need to think about balancing out the rate at which you implement versus questions of local capacity? How do we think about balancing energy access versus climate mitigation? So basically what ends up happening, and I can say the same is true in the agriculture area and so on and so forth. So basically, in a manner of speaking, while the NDCs are a starting point about a conversation about how to undertake climate action, very quickly you get enveloped in a very larger set of questions that adds to the complexity. I mean, the NDCs by themselves are complex, but then you're talking about adding to this diverse range of NDCs a set of other issues that developing countries have to think about. And that leads us to this question of how do you think strategically about choosing pathways to implement particular NDCs? How do you actually implement these pathways? And as you go along, how do you learn how to do better over time? I would actually posit that all of these are important elements of NDC implementation. And the question is, how does a country organize itself in order to undertake this challenge effectively? We know that a range of actors are involved in these different elements, whether you're talking about a group of actors that's actually thinking about what's the right pathway, and this may require actually a real deep understanding of the social, political, economic, local, cultural context. But once you think about a pathway, how do you actually implement? What is the kind of actors you bring together? What are the resources you marshal? You know, what kind of finance may be needed at what stage? How do you organize all of that? It might require development of partnerships, networks, but really, in a sense, coordinating the flow of people and all of that. The point I want to really then re-emphasize is that this leads us to a kind of very complex picture. And so developing countries have to start moving forward on this implementation given the tight time frame, while also thinking about how to do it, right? And that turns out to be a kind of a really big challenge. And I think this is precisely where South-South cooperation can offer a huge benefit. I think you made the point, and Ivo actually emphasized the point, that really all implementation has to be in a local context, right? It must flow out of and be cognizant of that, again, the social, economic, political, cultural context in which it happens. Many countries are, in a sense, running their experiments in terms of implementing various kinds of climate action. I think there's much to be learned in the policies, the business models, the partnerships, the networks, the institutional organizations that are needed to put it all together. But I would actually say it's not just the what of what policies and what business models, but the how also of how countries have actually been able to put together these processes. What are the kind of actors that have played important roles? And I think as an academic, in fact, our role is really to step back and think about common principles, common ways of thinking. And in a sense, I think these are the kinds of learnings that will flow out of each country's experiences. And then I think sharing these experiences against countries that actually have commonalities, I think has great benefit. So let me just end with making 3 points of, I think, what this kind of South-South cooperation of learning from our experiences, sharing experiences, understanding from each other's context, and adapting that understanding to the local. I think it'll really start to get at this question that we've talked about in the UNFCCC outside a lot, the question of capacity. What capacity is actually required for countries to undertake their climate action? How do you actually then, using these capacities, allow for more effective implementation of the NDCs, but actually looking forward, also how do you design and think about the next generation of NDCs, right? And how do you engage with the international processes? You know, Ivo talked about a range of international organizations and bilateral, multilateral, UN, non-UN. How do you even engage with the international process to make, you know, to in a sense to advance your goals? So I think to me, South-South cooperation offers a really key set of opportunities in order to help developing countries move forward on better, more effectively, more efficiently, and faster implementing their NDCs. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Ambuj. you know, in a sense, is almost begging the question I wanted to ask Colonel Sethi. If these are the kinds of issues, the kinds of approaches that you need to make South-South cooperation happen, what we have in place is FIPIC, the Forum for India and the Pacific Island countries. So could you share with us what FIPIC is about? What are its aims and targets?
Morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'll throw some light on FIPIC per se as to what, as a government, we are doing for the FIPIC, Indian government especially. We have gathered here to deliberate on the measures of creating a sustainable future for the world. And this is of vital importance, and a low carbon development path to growth is a must in ensuring our existence. One key measure for achieving this goal is through partnerships, which are based on mutual understanding and respect, cognizant of unique challenges being faced by the member countries. This is what we have tried to achieve through FIPIC, that is Forum for India Pacific Island Cooperations. Ladies and gentlemen, FIPIC is a unique global partnership which is based on common aspirations of the people and the challenges we face, including those of sustainable development and those arising from the climate change. Some of the highlights of the commitment made by India in the FIPIC, I shall just briefly touch upon them. We have so far given $30 million as part of our grant in aid program for the sustainable development of Pacific Island countries. Earlier, the grant used to be $125,000 per Pacific Island country, which has been raised to $200,000 post FIPIC 1, that is in 2014. The Honorable Prime Minister of India had announced this. Thereafter, there is a Pan-Pacific Island project which is being developed under CEIT. In that, it will be providing a platform for telemedicine and tele-education. The pilot project is being set up in one of the PICs, that is PNG, and some of the PICs are yet to sign the MOU. We will be going ahead and implementing this at the fast pace so that the Pacific Island countries can benefit the most from this. Then there is a adaptation fund of US $1 million which we have already implemented. In that, basically we are utilizing this fund for disaster management at a short notice, when our experts can go study, analyze, come back and give us the detailed report based on which we can provide whatever best we can to the Pacific Island countries. In addition, there is a major project that we have undertaken for training these solar mamas. These are the solar engineers who have been trained at Barefoot College, Telonia, wherein so far we have trained about 70 solar mamas who are adept in assembling the solar panels. They have already done so, and now in phase 2, these solar panels will be assembled and they will be transported to the Pacific Island countries, and these solar mamas who have been trained from respective countries will be sort of assembling them there, installing them there, and will carry out repair works. This is a major project of 10.25 crores. Besides this, training in disaster management and mitigation, this is again a project which we have undertaken, wherein recently in November this year, last year, from 20th to 25th of November, we have trained 2 representatives each from the Pacific Island countries at Indian National Center for Ocean Information Services in Cois. These people were given a 1-week training along with mock drills which were carried out at Bhubaneswar, and they were trained to understand the nuances of tsunami as to how to deal with it, how to anticipate such kind of eventuality coming up, and what actions are to be taken to minimize the losses. Besides this, there are various other projects which because of lack of time I will not be able to cover. I would also like to take this opportunity to highlight the need for enhanced and more coordinated support from the international community in terms of capacity building, technology transfer, funding and technical support for developing countries. It is crucial for emerging economies, those of us from the global south, to collaborate, to take proactive steps to combat climate change and sustainable development. All stakeholders have to be brought together through awareness building, through incentives, policies and various laws to effectively tackle these massive challenges. There is a need to cutting edge engineering and technology which is suitable for our economies and an opportunity to leapfrog the learning curve from the help. I think I am running short of time. Have a lot to cover, but in the end I would just conclude by saying that we solicit cooperation and support for our efforts to build resilience in emerging economies and hope to see our unique partnership being a catalyzing force for many more such global partnerships. Thank you very much.
Colonel Sethi, I am extremely sorry that you had to cut short your presentation, because this clearly provides a framework for South-South cooperation. The kinds of things that you spoke about, the disaster management relationship, the training capacity building for the solar mamas, are at the heart of a sustainable process, whether it is the disaster management work or whether it is a market for solar, for it to survive in the countries themselves. As we look to the future, and particularly the NDCs and the larger climate change issues, there obviously are many areas where a greater degree of interaction is needed. And I am turning to François Martel to help us walk through this. What are the kinds of gaps you see where South-South cooperation could effectively help in moving and accelerating the agenda to address climate change?
Thank you, Dr. Mathur. I have first and foremost a few slides.
Sure.
Just to show the extent of the Pacific Islands. You know, when we talk about the Pacific Islands, in most cases, people mix them all together. In fact, there are 21 countries and territories in the Pacific that cover the equivalent of more than 20 million square kilometers of EEZ and land mass. And they're all different culturally, in language. More than 2,000 languages are spoken in the Pacific. And they also are extremely different in terms of geomorphology. So we have continental islands, and we have volcanic islands, high volcanic islands, and we have atolls, coral atolls. So there's a completely different context from one country to the other. And this really needs to be taken into consideration when we look at this. In relation to India, this is 4 times bigger than India, including both the EEZ of India and its land mass. Just to give things in perspective, if you thought that India was big, you can imagine what the Pacific Islands is in comparison. This is important because when we do a gap assessment or a capacity building assessment or needs assessment from the Pacific Islands, we found out that we really need to actually look at it from a national perspective. And priorities vary, whether they are from the Marshall Islands, or if they are from Papua New Guinea, or if they are from Samoa or the Cook Islands, and then particularly in relation to the coalition of atoll nations for climate change, which are mainly atoll nations of Tuvalu, Kiribati, Marshall Islands, and the small territory of New Zealand called Tokelau. So this is to put things in context when I speak about these islands. And it also epitomized the fact that the key elements related to remoteness, isolation, and lack of connectivity are absolutely elements that needs to be addressed in relation to the NDCs. Our organization is relatively new, although I've worked in the Pacific now for nearly 35 years in most of these countries, the reality is to get a clear picture of what should be the key priorities for each of the countries and try to actually amalgamate this into an overall picture is quite difficult. So here we have the preferences for our 10 key priorities. And what we found out, in fact, is that in relation to the 10 key priorities of leaders, the main ones are actually related to education and capacity building for sustainable development. Now, what does that mean and how does that translate in terms of activities or areas of need for capacity building? Really, we have done our surveys in 12 different countries. The results of the consultations show clearly that, in effect, the key elements are related to sustainable land management, sustainable and island resilience, the blue economy, and green islands. So related to the terrestrial and the ocean resources as well. And this is quite interesting because elements related to mitigation, so we're talking about here island resilience and mitigation, while in fact the adaptation and island resilience, while in fact mitigation is not considered to be a key point of importance or priority for the Pacific Islands. Interestingly, the NDCs, most of the NDCs of the Pacific Islands are actually inclusive of mainly activities related to energy and mitigation. A few elements of adaptation, but in the Pacific, because of this extensive area, 75% of emissions are actually caused by the transport sector, not the energy sector. So this is really, really important because it also amplifies the elements related to the needs in terms of priorities for the Pacific Islands. And what we found out is that what are actually these capacity needs are really related to issues of land management and marine and land marine resources management. And this is when we realize we have a lot of difficulties. Still in the Pacific, we have one of the highest deforestation rate in the world. It's close to 3%. And not all, of course, islands have forests, but it's still an important element. And if you're looking at me right now, I would consider myself one of the youngest foresters remaining in the Pacific. So there is definitely a need for engaging activities, particularly for climate adaptation and resilience in relation to agroforestry, reforestation, watershed management, watershed restoration, community forestry, social forestry. In fact, I did my entire research in focusing on the work that was done in India in the 70s and the 80s on social forestry. And that remains really extremely lacking in terms of expertise in the Pacific. We do not do reforestation at scale. We restore watersheds with 1 or 2 or 3 hectares per year. That's going nowhere in terms of restorations of environments. So natural solutions are specifically asked in terms of capacity. So I'll conclude to focus on the measures and why South-South cooperation is so important for us. And I say this now with experience because we do have a partnership with FIPIC. It is really essential in that partnerships at the South-South cooperation level to include the private sector and the companies and the businesses in the process of engaging with local communities and also civil society, and use the success of civil societies in order to the success and implementation at grassroots level to ensure that the projects and the activities are completed in full. And I think that that will essentially conclude. And I'd like to reiterate, for example, the importance of civil society with this engagement at capacity level. The think tanks, the expertise of the South is far more adapted than all the work that's been done in the Pacific for the last 70 years on agriculture, forests, and fisheries. And we're still exactly at the same place because it's always been a North-South relationship. Well, a South-South relationship in the sense Australia and New Zealand versus the Pacific Islands. And I think now it's really the time for the Asia-Pacific and particularly the partnerships with India to actually grow and ensure that we have addressing the issues of climate change in the Pacific. So thank you very much.
Thank you, François. Your first slide was very revealing. And I think it places in context, it places the issue in context. We are not talking, as the Prime Minister said, of small island states. We are talking of large ocean countries. Let me turn to, François, from your discussion of the Pacific Islands to the specificity of Fiji. Joshua, you are the permanent secretary for, amongst other things, environment of the government of Fiji. What are the kinds of challenges that Fiji faces, particularly in its NDCs, and the rationale for South-South collaboration?
Thank you, Dr. Mathur. And first and foremost, thank you, family of TERI, for affording us with this privilege to be here today and being able to share Fiji's experience and the gaps that Fiji faces. And also, I bring you warm greetings on behalf of the Prime Minister of Fiji and the government and the civil service in Fiji. All of us here probably in the room do realize and of course recognize Fiji's role in the COP23, being the president holding the presidency of COP23. You know, time and time and again, this keeps ringing, and it gets mentioned that Fiji, like other Pacific nations, is one of the most insignificant contributor to the effects of climate change. However, our issues towards climate change are unique and also the most, because we are at the forefront and bear the brunt of effects of climate change. We are in a situation of relocating 42 villages, and we've already done 3 to bring them over the sea rise level. Since our issues are unique and we haven't contributed to the kind of catastrophe that we see, the impact from climate change, we have partly, I would say, very cautiously say that traditionally our systems and processes of mitigation and adaptation have not been geared up to what we're facing today. So if you talk about Fiji's gaps, because not just because we have not contributed, but because also we didn't expect to see this coming with this force and this brunt, we are gearing up ourselves to face. I mean, even as I speak, a few days ago, only about 3 days ago, 3-4 days ago, as I landed in Delhi, I was kind of listening with anxiety to see what had happened to some of our villages because of Cyclone Gita. And I was told earlier this morning by one of the panelists that the Parliament House of Tonga was down. And imagine a nation's parliament going down because of a natural event, which is beyond anyone's control. So the gap there, primarily I'll draw into climate change intelligence, and I'll in a moment come back and explain what I mean by that. Also human resources, and of course financial resources. Among intelligence, I'll tell you one thing, and I'll give a practical example. Not a fortnight or a week goes by without an issue being escalated to my desk by my directors when it comes to adaptation issues versus development. When I say development, I'm talking about business development, I'm talking about our resorts that are built. Now, Fiji is an island nation. We are made up of about 333 islands. Our entire livelihood, I wouldn't say entire, our livelihood, grossly a lot of it depends upon tourism. And we build a lot of resorts near the coastal areas, which are vulnerable and prone to catastrophic events from climate change. So then what we do is, keeping up with our national policies and the NDCs and the other stuff that we say, we talk about mangroves. We talk about other assets that the nation has. And when developers come, want to raise it to the ground and build a nice marina, there's the struggle within you to whether you allow mangroves to be taken off or you allow development, the very same development that feeds you and sustains you. So like I said, not a week it comes. So then I want to go and see one step further. How do I rectify it? Do I do relocation of mangroves So how about the meadows, sea meadows that we are having, the marshes that we have, the corals, all of these struggling to fight the effects of climate change. Fiji has the third largest reef in the world, coral reef in the world, the Great Sea Reef. Yet it's getting degraded because of sea acidification, the part of the reef that's dying. Yet we have millions of tourists who come to visit these reefs. So the gap is the intelligence, primarily, in being able to handle such a situation for which we have not been geared up, number one. Number two, human resources. I sit on several panels of interviewing people to get quality candidates who have climate change knowledge and expertise, who will be able to not just provide policies, but like one of my fellow panelists said, not just being a think tank, but making it work is a challenge as well. And the third, of course, in a few months from now, in a couple of months, we should be going into our annual budgetary process, is how do we and where do we seek resources to be able to do all these things? If you take, we've set up a separate ministry called Ministry for Waterways, because that's something we were never geared up. Our drains, our waterways were never geared up for the amount or the brunt that we face through climate change impacts. So these are key areas. Now, through the South-South partnership that we are developing with TERI and the MOU that I'm about to sign in a few minutes from now, we will be addressing these very same challenges through the various areas. What does it do for environment impact analysis? How does intelligence or intel help this situation, number one? Number two, how does it also help in a way in which we could look at our waste management practices? So the various things are being covered under this partnership that we're going to be signing. Last, before I conclude, Chair, what I'd like to also mention is, most of us would have heard about the Talanoa style of partnership that has been widely spoken about in and around the COP23. Talanoa dialogue is very unique in that it promotes a cooperation that's transparent, accountable, inclusive, and takes into account the partnership basis where you bring what you have to the table, we bring what we have to the table, so we could all make the best out of it, filling in the gaps that we are aware of. That's about it.
Thanks very much, Joshua. I think this wealth of examples tells us of the kinds of both common challenges, but also the kinds of opportunities for cooperation. And as I was mentioning to Colonel Sethi, this also opens our eyes to areas where the FIPIC cooperation could be expanded, depending really on what the countries ask for. This has to be a country-driven approach. Before we sign the declaration of partnership between TERI and the Fiji and the Government of Fiji, let me open up the floor for questions. And what I'll do is I'll take 2 or 3 questions and then ask the panelists to respond along with their final comments. Could I have a show of hands, please? 1, 2, 3. OK. Could I ask Dr. Sharma to start? And Dr. Sharma, if you could identify yourself as well. There's a mic coming to you.
I'm Dr. Sharma. I've been with Planning Commission of Government of India. My question is to the board. What do we learn from Kyoto for implementation of COP21, and what kind of cooperation you suggest? Then second is that, is it China and USA which will balance the INDCs for rest of the world, developing world, as rest of the developing world is learning to consume a reasonable level of energy per capita? Are INDCs a right measure of emission reduction? Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, Abhishek. And again, identify yourself.
Hello. Yeah, I'm a student of TERI School of Advanced Studies. I'm doing my master's in environment studies. Well, I listened to Boer and Mr. Ambuj. They told about how we are skating in a thin ice and how these SDGs would fail if we don't walk. We talked about partnerships. Mr. François Martel told about the strategies that we are doing. And my question is, where are we failing? What is the gap? We talked about if we don't act in a better way, as Mr. Joshua said. So the problems are coming at a very larger scale. So where is the gap? Yeah, okay. We know that.
So let me focus your question. One is the physical gaps that both François and Joshua spoke about, but I think yours is a higher level of question. What are the reasons that these gaps exist, or what are the mechanisms to make them, to address them?
Just to add one thing, we take the pride of the Paris Agreement that we have done in 2015. So we cannot say that the policy was a failure one, that the policies are not strong. So what are the gaps that we are having in implementing those policies in different countries, which has a diverse way of governance?
Okay.
Thank you.
And then we had a question there. If I don't see it, then I'm going to turn to colleagues and ask them to respond to these questions as well as their own final comments. Ivo, since the largest number of questions seemed to be aimed at you, maybe I'd request you to start.
Okay, I'm sure my colleagues on the panel have a lot to say in response as well. A lot of the questions are directly or indirectly around what have we learned from Kyoto and around the NDCs, including your questions, sir. I don't think we've really learned an awful lot from the Kyoto approach, to be honest. In my first main climate conference as Executive Secretary of the Convention, which was in Bali, we framed an agenda which had 4 pillars: adaptation, mitigation, technology, and finance. Mm-hmm. And my sense is that on the way since then, we have lost those pillars. We're placing a great deal of emphasis on mitigation, less emphasis on adaptation, and technology, finance, and capacity building, which was a very strong point of yours, François, are not getting the equal amount of attention that they need in order to come to delivery. So I think some of the balance in the agenda has lost as we're beginning to forget the fundamental principle in the convention that obliges industrialized countries to help poorer countries to engage. That's one observation. My second observation is that that a lot of our around Paris and post-Paris response seems to be in the context of creating new institutions, often new institutions at an international level, which are fishing in the same very limited pool of resources. And maybe we should be putting, international cooperation is great, but let's put more emphasis on national implementation. Mm-hmm. And there, as a sort of closing remark, I was very struck when Ambuj, Sagar, when you characterized the NDCs as being very ambitious, which I think is true. I don't think they're so ambitious in terms of their resolve to address the issue of climate change, but they are very ambitious in terms of what countries are seeking to achieve. What I find a bit dangerous or worrying about many of the NDCs is that a lot of them are conditional, that they're conditional on support and cooperation being provided. For example, the NDC of Indonesia says we'll do 27% deviation from business as usual on our own, but we'll even go to 43 if we get support and help from others. So the crux for me really is that cooperation, not just in terms of industrialized countries meeting their financial obligations, but also in terms of the knowledge and experience exchange at a regional level that all of you on this panel have talked about, and that marriage of resources and intellect to focus on delivery on that great ambition.
Many thanks. I think that kind of wraps up the issue of, in a sense, the learning that has occurred or not occurred. François, I think one of the key learnings that came out of your session and Ivo captured was the issue of capacity. And given the kinds of questions that they're there, where do you think, what are the reasons for the capacity not being there, and what can be done about it?
This is a different question than the one that the gentleman has, but this is a lot more complex actually to answer the issues related to capacity building. There's been a lot of capacity building in the Pacific Islands. There's also a lot of revolving positions among the Pacific Islanders that have degrees and technical degrees and professional degrees. And so things move and the capacity building has to be repeated constantly. But apart from this, I wanted to address the issue, if you permit me to do this, Mr. Chair. I'd like to look at the gaps. Because our organization was created in 2015, just a few months before COP21 in Paris. And one of the key outcomes of this, of our summit that created the organization was actually the Suva Declarations for Climate Change that the Pacific Island leaders then championed in Paris. And you will all remember, and in fact I've heard John Kerry say this, that without the influence and the hard work of the Pacific Island leaders at COP21, we would have probably not have an agreement. And the fact is, we did have a lot of different issues in the call, in that declaration, and many have fell off the Paris Agreement. And this is what I consider to be the gaps. We reached the 1.5 degrees Celsius, at least the mention into the text of the 1.5 degrees Celsius. We achieved the loss and damage paragraph, which the United States wanted to actually completely disappeared, just by removing the word litigation. But loss and damage remains part of the Paris Agreement. But there are a lot of things that fell off it, and in particular, the ones that do have an impact on achieving the target of 1.5 degrees Celsius in the long term. And these ones are transport emissions, because transport has been removed from the Paris Agreement and given the responsibility to ICAO and for the aviation and IMO for the maritime shipping. And their current percentage of emissions globally is around 5%. And estimated to be by 2040 or 2050, close to 15% of global emissions. That's like 5 times, 6 times more than Germany. So obviously this needs to be addressed. But there's a very, very slow intake from the industry, working with ICAO and IMO in moving that forward. The other one is an insistence on a moratorium on phasing out of coal, moratorium on fossil fuels explorations and exploitation. And we now know, because of this carbon bubble, that in fact, if we need to keep 80% of the coal that's currently in the current reserves actually in the ground. And that is something very, very important. And the reality is, with the latest figures from the IPCC, from what I understood from a previous session, we're aiming at 5 degrees Celsius. Now, we already have a lot of issues in terms of impact, including increased velocity of cyclones. We have ocean acidification and ocean temperature, oxygenation. All these elements are actually coming with we have 1.1 degrees Celsius, I believe, right now. And then, so we're very close to the 1.5 degrees Celsius. We should achieve this within the next 10 years. So the key issue is, how are we going to manage with 5 degrees Celsius? And this is where the requirement is for a paradigm shift. The Paris Agreement is visionary in many ways, because it does require a paradigm shift. But not everybody has actually bought on to the paradigm shift. And this is where we have a problem. This is where the gaps are, as far as I'm concerned.
Thanks. Joshua, any final comments?
Yes, that was a very interesting question about why it's not happening. You know that there are gaps, and why are we not? So mine is going to be a little more practical from a bureaucrat's point of view. François, my colleague who also spends a lot of time in Fiji, apart from the other islands, was talking about capacity building and people involved having degrees, which is very true. Again, not probably every other month I sign off on one of the civil servants going abroad to Australia and New Zealand for a postgraduate degree in either climate science or environment management. But that isn't just sufficient. That's the one point. Because the populations are much smaller, but the land mass, the workforce is smaller, the land mass is as large as or even larger than other countries. So like I said, the larger land mass and larger geography is exposed to some of these events that happen or some of the climate change impacts. So we are not geared up. So work takes that much longer to complete, number one. Number two is, and this is about all over the world, not just Fiji, is the need for this, with a sense of urgency to get things going. And that needs to be ingrained in not just civil service or CSOs or NGOs. It has to be a blanket all over the world kind of practice where things get done within framework with a commitment. And that is, I was just about to mention that this partnership agreement you're talking about is a milestone, not just going to be a think tank, because I'll say that we've met with the framework and the timelines very, very much within what we have had to do in the last few months. We had this date. We ran a lot of issues halfway through, wanting to be able to put things in place, get agreements from cabinets, but still we stuck to our dates. We meant business in what we wanted to do. So if we've been able to achieve that today, we will be able to achieve the milestones mentioned in the partnership as well, very well. And I'm very confident of Chairman, Chair, and your team.
I think I would actually say, and I want to pick up a phrase that actually Joshua used, which I really like, which is climate intelligence. I think I would actually suggest that we failed because we've not, we as in, when we are saying countries, actually I would very often say even individuals and organizations, have not really thought about this notion of climate intelligence. That is to say, how do you think intelligently about the climate problem? For many years, I think we just assumed, many developing countries assume that it will be a north-south cooperation that really is going to be at the heart of addressing the climate problem. I mean, that's how the UNFCCC is written. I think it took a while to realize that that's not happening. And what that leaves is actually, although, well, it's not happening to the extent it's required, and so what I think that leaves developing countries, in a sense, have to reorganize their thinking, both in how do you marshal resources of different kinds internally, but also through other actors that are much more likely to cooperate than certainly the North-South. And I think that's where the South-South comes in. I think it was very telling when Ivo talked about the fact that in Bali, there were 4 pillars, capacity was not even part of the conversation. Whereas I fundamentally believe that if we need to not fail, we really have to focus on the capacity question. And that capacity question, I think, is really something we've barely begun to unpack. In other words, what is even the kind of capacity needed in order to advance climate action? I don't think there's a simple answer to that. And let me then take it up even one level further. A lot of activities that are going on in the climate regime really are project-centered. It's different kinds of projects. It's not about systematic capacity building. And therefore, I think it's not just even focusing on capacity building and thinking about what is the right kind of capacity that's needed, but I would actually end by saying it's even the capacity to build capacity. Now, I know that sounds like a bit of a tongue twister, but I think that fundamentally is the heart of the problem, and I think that is why we failed. Because we've really not, at least in developing countries, built the capacity to even engage in questions of capacity. So.
Thank you very much. I think it's a phrase that I'll remember, capacity to build capacity. Thank you. I think it's a concept that we need to keep in place as we go ahead. Without further ado, we will sign the declaration of partnership in a minute, but before that, let me join you in thanking this excellent panel for this discussion. And Joshua, may I invite you to do the honors. Let's do the first page and absolutely wonderful, and I heard what you said about the timelines. Thank you. What?
I take it.
Unless we need to do every page, which we can do.
Yeah,
okay, sure. Colleague, many thanks, and I think we end this session with a true movement towards partnership. This is a session which has actually done what it was for. Thanks. Martin, all yours.
Thank you so much. An excellent discussion. Thank you. Now we head off for lunch. Please be back as soon as possible after 1:30 for a packed afternoon session. Just a reminder, if you've got those little voting gizmos, please return them to the TERI staff on the door as you leave. Thanks again.